We're going to talk about the anatomy of type and learning a very specific vocabulary that is associated with different parts of letters. Here we've got a page that shows the most common terms. There are lots more, but these are the ones that I want to focus on. And you may as well just plan on committing this information to memory so that you can discuss different parts of letter shapes and recognize different fonts quickly based on the different characteristics. Probably the most important thing on this page is the baseline. And the baseline is that invisible line on which type sits. Everything is measured from that baseline. So it's really kind of the most critical recognition when you look at a page. This line is the X height, very cleverly named for the designation of the height of a lowercase x, or any of the lowercase letters. The X height will vary, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, but the X height varies in different fonts fairly dramatically. This is the ascender line. Anything that goes above the X height is considered an ascender. Anything that dips below the baseline is called a descender. Now, your capital letters sometimes have their own line, and it's not an important distinction to remember, and that would be the cap line. But sometimes your capital letters are not the same height as your ascenders. Might be shorter, might be taller. This is called the crossbar. The top of this, where the 2 points meet, is called the apex. Down here we have the tail. Q is the most common letter to have a tail, and they're very unique for each different font. When you have two strokes and you have this area that is trapped in between and it doesn't close at the top, it's called an open counter. This is the counter area, and this is an open counter. When you have different weights on your strokes, primarily on serif type, and you have one that is smaller than the other, the smaller one is called a hairline stroke, regardless of how thick it is. This is the shoulder. The arch on this H would also be on the M or the N, and that's called the shoulder. You can see this area in here is closed off, so it's a closed counter. Now, you can call it a closed counter and an open counter, but primarily this is just called a counter when it's closed. It's called an open counter when it's open. This line out here shows the arc and the shape of the bowl. Now it has a closed counter, but the inside area is the counter area, and this outside area is the bowl. The dot over the I, or a lowercase j, is called a tittle. The way a character ends is a terminal. So technically this is a terminal as well. We often refer to terminals as this shape that comes down. Now this one would be a teardrop terminal. You could also have a ball terminal where you've got a much rounder area in here, or you could just have it where it just ends, like this one. Some people will call this a finial. Technically it's a terminal and a finial, so kind of interchangeable, but this would not be called a finial. This would always be called the terminal. This is called a two-story G. Sans serifs often are considered one-story Gs, and this one is called a two-story G. This little part that sticks out here is an ear. You've got the link that attaches the top or the bowl of the G to the loop or the bottom. Now this is an open loop because it doesn't meet right here. This part that kind of swirls out like this is a spur. When you have a stroke that comes in at an angle, or a diagonal, I guess, to the main stroke, you end up with something called the crotch. You've got the arm and the leg. The parallel or the vertical stroke is called a stroke. One of my favorite things to talk about is the middle part here, the enclosed closed counter of an E, but it's got its own name and it's called the eye. I just think it's funny to call it the eye of the E. And then you've got the spine, which is this kind of diagonal area that comes down here. Now, the yellow part up here designates something called a ligature. And a ligature is where letters, there are actual glyphs built into the particular font that will substitute for certain characteristics, or certain character combinations, better to say, that are awkward when they're by themselves. Most common ligatures are F-I, F-F-I, F-F, F-F-L. Sometimes you'll have a T-T, and there are some others, but these are the most common ones. Now, ligatures are something you can turn on in your preferences, or under your type and paragraph controls, because in all of your software, all of your Adobe software, because it's just, it looks better than if they're standalone. You end up on a standalone area with very awkward spacing between here because they have to try to break up where the crossbars go across. They don't want them to meet, and you don't want this to run into this, so you've got all this extra space and it just looks really awkward. And then most especially when you have the eye, the tittle gets in the way and it makes this look like a blob. So what they've done is they've connected these letters, the crossbar all the way across in the serif, and then they've eliminated the tittle for this ligature that you have here. And ligatures are something that you can use, you don't have to use, but it's important to know what they are so you can make the choice rather than let the default make the choice for you. As you can tell from what we've been talking about, it's really, really important to look at the details. Now, one of the quickest things to look at and most immediate things to notice when you're talking about a serif font is what kind of serif it is. You can see I've got 3 different examples here. One is a hairline serif, where you've got the thin serif that goes with the thicker strokes, and this is often in your modern serifs. And then you've got your bracketed, which shows the curve right here. This is a bracket that goes into the serif. And then you've got your slab serif, and if you remember, the slab serif means that the weight of the serif is roughly the same weight as the actual letter itself. If you look at these 3 examples of blocks of text, you can see how dramatically different they appear. Now, the letters themselves have a lot of different shapes, but by and large, you know, they're, like you can see on the capitals, they're H's. But when you get a whole block of copy, those serifs really come into play and can either enhance or detract from, or maybe just create the wrong or the right vibe that you want with the font choice that you've made. When you're trying to look and identify a particular font, there are certain letters that you want to look at. And they're very common letters to check because they're the most obvious places that they have differences. So for an A, obviously you want to look at that counter. The counter in the A is very different. If you look at the lowercase e, you've got the I of the E, very unique for each font. On the F, you've got not only the crossbar, but you've also got the terminal and the way that it ends. The Y, you look at the tail of the Y that comes down, and you can see that it's got that some of them have terminals, some of them just end, but they're very unique differences. On a G, you've got, is it a one-story G or a two-story G? You've got the loops, you've got the ears are very unique on G's. On the I and the J, you've got the tittles to look at. Tittles are often round, square, diamond, rectangle. Sometimes they look like accent marks, but they're very unique to the font itself. Also, the distance from the letter to the tittle varies dramatically from font to font. Another thing on the J when you come down is you've got the tail that comes down, and you can look at the terminal or the way that it ends. For your capital letters, you've got the apex on the A that you can look at. Does it end with a straight? Does it end with a point? Is it thick? Is it thin? Is it sawed off? You've got lots of things to look at there. On a G, the first thing you want to look at is, does it have a spur? Does it come down? This one has a spur that comes down. These do not. M and W, you've got all those vertexes and apexes and the way that they meet and the crotches, and you've got all sorts of things to look at there. Specifically on an M, do the vertical strokes, are they parallel or do they flare out slightly? On a W, do the two lines crisscross? Do they meet for a point? Do they meet with a serif? Does the vertex of the M, does it come all the way down to the baseline, or does it fall short? These are all very specific areas that you want to look at those differences in the letters. Now, we talked a little bit about X height and the differences in the X height, and here you can see three different examples. The one on the left is the most common kind of an average X height. The one in the middle is a very low X height, and the one on the right is a tall X height. Now, it's important to note here that I'm talking about in print. When you're talking about looking at things on the screen, people generally like a little bit larger X height and a little bit more spacing so that that light doesn't necessarily interfere with, but does enhance your readability and legibility of the font itself. But when you're talking about print, an average X height is the easiest one to read. It's not always the most interesting, but it's the easiest to read. And our goal with copy, if we put copy on a page, is we want somebody to read it. Now the reason, and it's a scientific reason, is when we read, we only read the tops of letters, okay? We scan it with our eyes. If we can't figure out what it says, then we go back and we read the whole word because we look at the whole thing. Now this all happens automatically. It's not like we can consciously say, oh, okay, now I can't read that. I need to go back and look at each letter. It just is the way it happens. When something has a short X height, this is what you see, and you can't read it. So it takes longer because you have to read by looking at all the letters. Same with a tall X height. You can't make the difference. There is more contrast in this top one in size, so it makes it easier and gives us the hints on how to read the copy. This is the main reason that all capital letters are really hard to read. It slows us down because there is no difference between them, and we have to look at each letter individually or recognize that in our brain when we read it, so it slows us down.